Well, welcome back to Storytelling, everyone. This is one of my favorite events Naomi Marin does, so much so because a lot of our programming is educational. It is inviting experts to be able to talk about ongoing research or support services, loved ones and their families, but rarely, and I think in across the county, is there a time to really be able to sit and talk about these stories, right? That we're not just speaking about random people or statistics or numbers, but that this is a real lived experience, one that all of you are quite familiar with. And so I'm really grateful for this series and that it was made possible by the Mental Health Services Act, as well as granted to us by the Behavioral Health and Recovery Services in Marin County. This event will be recorded, partially because we don't want the stories to just live within this hour or so that we have together, one that can inform the stigma and build community in Marin County. So often, and this is what our previous executive director shared with me that I quickly found to be true when I joined Naomi Marin as a community engagement manager a few years ago, but returned as a volunteer. And this year is that, so many of our family members and loved ones have talked about how they feel like they can't really share their story, that there's a lot of stigma that they feel, whether it's in their own extended families, their immediate families, their neighbors. And I often come to this like almost shocking factor of like we're living these entire lives around people who see us frequently and have no idea. The storytelling series is also part of busting that stigma and being able to build community and safe places where we can discuss and talk about things that are difficult to talk about. And so what very grateful for this event, for being able to do just that. And stories can be very personal. Stories can have a lot of can raise a lot of emotions and also make us think in ways that we haven't necessarily have thought about before. And so a great way to be able to be present for storytelling, or when folks share their personal stories, whether in this setting or others, is to create an environment of compassion and care. And so a compassionate environment and a caring environment is one that we agree to be non-judgmental to the story or elements of the story that come up, knowing that this is a real experiences, and real experiences are quite raw, but also have their own message for the world as well. We are respectful of the story and the storyteller, and that we remain curious, right? I mentioned earlier that our stories have a message for the world, and curiosity is the ability to be reflexive and inquire about what that message is and what I can take and learn to do with it. And the second thing is also or the last thing is also to be supportive, and knowing that it is quite bold to be able to tell our stories. I think the number one fear in the United States is public speaking. So being able to be supportive and acknowledge that the storyteller is showing up tonight and bringing their whole selves, and so we should bring our compassionate selves. And on top of that, a reminder of that when themes come up in the story that might make you feel passionate and maybe even emboldened or tearful, that you be gentle with yourself. If this was easy, if this was something that came naturally to us, or if we didn't already know all the stories there are to know, then we wouldn't be in this program. And so wanted to remind everyone to be gentle with yourself. And then also know if you relate to elements of the story, or that you see yourself or your loved one in the story, that you are not alone. And this is also why we set up spaces like this, where we can share our stories and do so with a compassionate, caring, supportive community. And so without further ado, I won't talk for that much longer, but I wanted to take a moment to introduce our very special guest with us today, who is Marcia Naomi Berger. Naomi is also a psychotherapist and a licensed clinical social worker that practices in Marin County. And she has her own private practice and is also an author. So not only does she work with patients, but that she's also written about various elements of the therapy experiences and the lessons, and also her knowledge as well that she's learned. One of those books that are highly regarded for relationships include Marriage Minded, an A to Z guide to dating for lasting love and marriage. He also has a book that will probably and likely, if I'm great at predicting, will be very relevant for today. And you might have seen it in this email as well, which is the Bipolar Therapist. And it's a memoir of her perspectives and personal experiences, mental health, and her relationships. She also held very senior roles across different social working and sections, including child welfare, alcoholism and treatment, and psychiatry, and has served as a lecturer at the University of California School of Medicine. She was also the executive director for some time for the Jewish Family and Children's Services of the East Bay. And they do also a lot of work with refugees and migrations, and I know that from my own experiences with them. And that Naomi's also very passionate in helping people and building lasting, fulfilling relationships. She resides in San Rafael. Her husband, who is with us today. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I will pin Naomi so you can see her front and center. And let's give a warm welcome to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, for that lovely introduction. And I can relate so much to what you're saying about why we keep it a secret, mental illness and the stigma, because I went through all that and writing my book. I'll show you my book. It's called the Bipolar Therapist, book about my experience. And it's mostly about 15 years of my life when I was most affected by bipolar illness, which back then was called manic depression. It was that long ago. So I did want to write this book about 20 years ago, and I tried to, and I couldn't because it kept bringing back in some kind of PTSD way a lot of the horrors of what I went through. And even when, meanwhile, I wrote these two books about relationships. One's called Marriage Meetings for Lasting Love for couples, and the other book, which Miriam, you mentioned, Marriage Minded, an A to Z dating guide for lasting love. So I did that in the, 15 years or so after I started writing the book about the bipolar experience and what happened after. And then I finally got to where I guess I felt okay writing the book. And then I was afraid to publish it. But somebody I regard as a mentor who I asked, should I really publish this? I was already in the stage of having it edited professionally. I said, should I publish this? And this person said, yes, you should definitely publish it. It will help a lot of people. So that turned it for me. And I wrote the book. And as I said, it starts when I'm about almost 30 years old, which was a long time ago. And I was a respected therapist, senior psychiatric social worker at an alcoholism treatment center in San Francisco when I became manic on my way from San Francisco to New York for my sister's wedding. I didn't get to the wedding, and even on the way to the wedding, when the plane stopped in Chicago, I was walking around the airport thinking I could heal anybody whose path crossed mine. And to me, it seemed like everybody needed healing, and maybe we all do. We all have stuff, but this was a different kind of thing where I thought that I had these superpowers, and all I had to do was look at people and heal them. Somehow I made it back on the airplane after wandering the hallways, pseudo-healing people in Chicago in the airport. And I got back on the plane, got to New York, made it to my mother's house, the house I grew up in Rockaway, Queens, New York, and went to the beach. It was, if you see the book, you'll see it was various complicated things happened in Rockaway. And then it got to the point where it was time. Meanwhile, I had not, as happens, if any of you are familiar with mania, we are up several nights in a row. That's not unusual, not sleeping, thoughts racing. I was having various fantasies, one of which was that I was going to marry my therapist and all kinds of other stuff. And I ended up getting very irritated with my mother. And ran out on the street screaming at her. And that was when somebody, I thought it was my mother, but I recently was reading letters from people who wrote to me after my first experience. And one of them mentioned that the neighbors called the police. Anyway, I was holding this against my mother for a long time. I thought she was responsible for me to be taken by ambulance after the police were called, I guess. And I was taken to an absolutely horrible hospital. It was called Elmhurst. It was a county hospital in Queens. We were all, just about everybody was so doped up, we could hardly think, let alone read a magazine or follow a TV show. Then magazine was the big thing. I turned yellow from it with, I forgot what it's called. You get something that when you turn yellow. Oh, it's funny, I can't remember the name of it. Somebody may know. Anyway, I was there for 8 days. It was just horrible. It's like, and they keep giving you orange juice, which has the Thorazine in it. And so that was awful. And then I got transferred to a nice place, like a rehab place, where they took me off all the meds and got discharged a couple of weeks later. Back to work. At work, people were starting to look at me funny. You want to think that people who are therapists, people I worked with, rehab counselors, paraprofessionals, some recovering alcoholics, I think there's a general thought that these people are going to be compassionate and understanding, and some of them were, and others were really, really horrible. And I was harassed also, including sexually, and not, God forbid, not violated, but I want to read a little bit from my book because it's a sense of what it was like there. This was actually, I think I'm going to tell you something else first, because I had more than one hospitalization. After my first hospitalization, I went back to work. They had me on some little drug for a while, but it didn't agree with me. I stopped taking it. I did not accept that I had an illness. I thought it was all a fluke and that I was under stress. And so I went back to work, and I was doing okay at work again, because you know bipolar is episodic and you can have long remissions. Some people don't, some do. But a year later, I became manic, and I became manic at work. So my colleagues got to witness me running up and down the halls, interrupting therapy sessions or group therapy meetings, giving some gifts to colleagues. And my friends, people that I felt connected to at work, drove me to a hospital. I ended up getting hospitalized at Langley Porter. And that was, my other hospitalizations were decent places, not like the first one. I was given an MMPI test by the psychologist there, who told me that it showed that I was clearly manic depressive, the old term for bipolar, and that I should start taking lithium or my career would be ruined. I didn't believe him, and I didn't take lithium, and I discharged myself against medical advice, went home, went back to work. In the meantime, somewhere along here, I published a paper that I presented at a national conference about alcoholism and family systems, which you can actually find on the internet if you're interested in reading it. It's called Homeostasis, a Key Concept in Working with Alcoholic Family Systems, or something like that. But homeostasis in my name would get you there. And then 6 months later, I was hospitalized again at Macaulay Neuropsychiatric Hospital, where I had a very kind psychiatrist, and I also had wonderful support from 3 good friends and the man who was my boyfriend at the time. And the psychiatrist there encouraged me to start on lithium, but I still wasn't sure. But then my friends actually pleaded with me. They spoke to the psychiatrist. They pleaded with me to start lithium, and I did start lithium, and I was just fine on lithium for quite a few years. And I had one little slip because I went on a salt-free diet years later, and I had forgotten that salt potentiates lithium. But 3 days later, I was back on lithium and okay again. So meanwhile, I was advancing in my career, and I was also still stigmatized at work. So here's something that happened at the Alcoholism Treatment Center. Back at work, one of my colleagues, another social worker, grinned wickedly. We were in the office where the secretaries work. He was there, I was there, maybe one of the secretaries were there. He grinned wickedly. "I know what you're taking," he called. Then Steve danced a little jig and sang, "It starts with an L, then an I, then a T, then an H, and an I, and an U, and an M. Put it all together. What do you get? Lithium," he shouts triumphantly while the secretary tries to ignore him from her desk. Okay, here's another one. "Well, after that," I said, quaking inside, I turned my blandest clinical face toward him and said nothing. I moved him out of my mental file of safe people, put him into the one for predators, and gave him a wide berth. Jeff, the former minister, and his wife had recently adopted a baby. I supervised him clinically regarding his performance as an intake worker. We had enjoyed a respectful, professional relationship until he asked me, what if a supervisee wants to sleep with his supervisor? A2, brute? How would your wife feel about that? I countered weakly, caught off guard again. She got what she wanted, he said with an edge. Of course, the baby, I thought, ironically, an even exchange. Fortunately, I had some faithful friends at work, Ellen and June. I think I changed their names in the book, so pretend I didn't say their names, but it was such a long time ago, and I know they wouldn't mind. I can only say good things about them. I had lunch with one or both of them almost every day. They were extremely supportive. So anyway, this was a really toxic environment. Then I got recruited to work, guess where, at the psychiatric ward at San Francisco General Hospital. And nobody there, I learned eventually, when I wrote this book, I didn't know that nobody there knew that I had a mental condition and was taking medication for it. And I did very well there. I was very eager to, because whenever I was in the hospital, I could hardly wait to get out and get back to my life. And I felt that way about the patients that I was working with at San Francisco General. So I did my best to do the workups on them and make discharge plans and get them out as quickly as possible, which meant I had like more people I was working with, more patients than the other therapists, because I would get them out so quickly. But I was recognized there, and also for doing some training of psychiatric residents around how to do an intake on patients and things that fall into the social work and family therapy realm. And I was nominated for that faculty position, a clinical faculty position at the School of Medicine, the University of California, San Francisco. So that was all going very well. And I got tired of that. Like it was the same thing over and over. I had to get a lot of cases, and they were giving more because of changes. So I didn't get to do some of the fun administrative things that I wanted to do, including something that I found kind of curious, that each time I was hospitalized, it was around the time that my menstrual period arrived. So I initiated a study at San Francisco General with the female patients to find out whether this happened close to the time of when their period arrived, and a psychologist there helped me to look for statistical significance, and she said there was some, but not enough to really mount to something you can do something with, because sample wasn't large enough yet. I would have kept that going, except I didn't have the energy to do it in my spare time, and they weren't giving me the time anymore because of changes that made it that I'd have to take more patients. Anyway, so I took a break and ended up taking a job as executive director of the Jewish Family Service Agency in San Francisco, also where nobody knew what was going on. And maybe they did later, because when I had that salt-free experiment that I mentioned earlier, that happened when I was working at that agency, and that was not good. But anyway, I did get past that and moved on, and I'm trying to think what else should I share in my experience. Oh, I wanted to mention that besides the stigma at work, I had at least one dear friend ghost me, and one of my colleagues I'd been really close to at work. She didn't harass or anything, but she just distanced herself from me. We were no longer close colleagues and friends. So that's something that I know happens. And when I want to tell people what to do or how to think, how to deal with these kind of things that happen to you, and I can't say I did this real well at the time, but in retrospect, I wish somebody had said to me, that's their problem, it's not yours. Don't let them define you. Because, and this is what I do want to tell people, that we're all larger, much more complex than a diagnosis, and we all have strengths to contribute to the world. Like everybody else, we have areas where we are not so strong and areas where we really have a lot to offer. The psychiatrists agree, says my psychiatrist friend from way back, who also had no idea until I wrote the book that I had this bipolar condition. And he said that it's better now. There's not as much stigma, but it's still there and there's still a long way to go. So as an example of what seemed to me a surprising conversation that I had from people on FaceTime. My husband handed me his phone so I could join a FaceTime chat with people I'll call Jim, Jack, and Steve. We've known Jim socially for over 30 years.
Yes, you could.
And we've seen Jack, a friendly man who shows up at our synagogue and asks people, the same people over and over, how are you? And I didn't remember Steve, but he said we met on a blind date as singles around 40 years ago. So after some small talk, I mentioned that I had a book launch coming out for the Bipolar Therapist. That was back in May, soon after it was published at Book Passage in Madeira. So after some small talk, I mentioned launch. And what's your book about? Jim said. It's a memoir, I said, thinking that should take care of it. What's the title? Asked Steve. Well, I thought, because I was really still very in secret mode. I took a deep breath. The Bipolar Therapist, a journey from madness to love and meaning, I said, feeling like I just confessed and expecting harsh judgments. What happened next surprised me. I couldn't read Jim. He looked blank and said nothing. He's the one who knew me for 30 years. Barely missing a beat, Steve said, I'm OCD. You probably know what that means, obsessive compulsive disorder. And then he named several of his medical conditions for which he takes 12 different pills daily. Without specifying the nature of his mental illness, Jack commented on the stupid conservatorship they put him on. Those were his words, the stupid conservatorship. I felt relieved, almost joyous, to have people act like what had been my shameful secret was no big deal. By writing The Bipolar Therapist, I'd begun to release my shame. I no longer want mental illness to be something to hide behind or be ridiculed for. If somebody shuns or judges me negatively for having had a mental illness, I want to realize that it is their problem. It's not mine. So I've been coming out to other people lately. Some say I had no idea. A friend told me a story that gives me hope for a future when people with a mental illness will feel okay about opening up. A mutual acquaintance I'll call Ken was diagnosed schizophrenic a long time ago. Now in his 60s, he's led a full life. He's married, raised a son, and owned a successful courier business. He saved enough to buy 2 homes, one of which he rents to a tenant for retirement income. Ken says he still hears voices, but he has learned to ignore them. Ken sat beside a stranger at a dinner party. After some small talk, his new acquaintance said, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a schizophrenic, Ken countered. That sounded like a joke with a good punchline. If only we could all share our psychiatric labels as quickly and confidently. I long for the day this will happen. I'm grateful to all for helping us move toward that time by sharing their stories, and so grateful for NAMI for existing and that all that it is doing to help reduce the stigma and increase compassion, understanding, and respect for people who have a mental illness. My memoir, The Bipolar Therapist, also describes my dysfunctional dating pattern and its consequences. It also describes my relationship with my mother, which became very conflictual after my first hospitalization, which I had blamed on her. I could not blame hospitalizations on her after my second hospitalization because she wasn't around, and I went to New York. I hadn't mentioned that my second hospitalization at Langley Porter happened right after I returned from New York at the wedding of my best friend from childhood. But I did not tell my mother, and I told everyone to tell my mother not to tell them that I would be in the area. So I couldn't blame my mother anymore. And there's more in the book about how I eventually reconciled with my mother, which is, for me, it's very poignant when I read it and how it happened. And if you want me to, I can read a little bit about my book with something about my relationship with my mother, which sums up a lot, with parts of her that I loved and also felt very embarrassed about or upset about. How is our time, though? Are we going to do Q&A around now, or should I do that?
Oh, we're so good on time. So if you would want to share a bit of that, I'm sure that would be very moving for mothers that are in the call right now that are currently
Okay.
process.
All
There's
right.
some daughters in the call too. So
Okay. My mother was, I think she might have been about 75, maybe something like that. I maybe in the text here, I don't remember. When she decided to become a clown as a hobby or avocation. And this was not so easy for me to accept. So here we are. I'm in her car and she's talking, and in the back seat is her good friend, and we're having this conversation about clown stuff. So we're in the car, and the light has just turned red, and my mother, of blessed memory, she's not alive anymore, she removed a photo from her wallet and handed it to me. I was sitting next to her in the front seat. "Take a look, sweetie," she said. Sweetie, I'm still sweetie. I didn't get this whole thing. My mother, a clown. The photograph showed two stocky clowns. The shorter one's hair was a wild, woolly, multicolored wig in shades of green, pink, purple, and orange. She was my mother, in a bright yellow blouse and a red circle skirt. She looked up at the taller one with a mischievous grin. I wouldn't have recognized her in a crowd. Nancy, the other clown, towered over my mother in the photo. A black outline around her mouth accented her big clown frown. Okay, I'm going to skip a little here. I hoped this phase of my mother's would soon pass. Her clown persona embarrassed me the way I felt as a teenager seeing her dance around the house. But this was more extreme. Your mother's a big kid, said Esther appreciatively. A big kid. I suddenly saw my mother with new eyes. She was a big kid who loved a good time. And I'm hearing more about clowning. And then I say, "Sounds terrific, Mom," I said, forcing a smile. I'm not fond of clown acts, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings. Your mother is so creative, Esther said. She used to invent dances and choreograph performances at the academy. That's the orphanage which she grew up in, which is another part of this story. People still talk about her rope dance. I turned to her, nodding and smiling politely. Yes, I know. Marcia, you'd like clown college, my mother said as we neared the airport. You'll have fun, and with your artistic talent, you'll be great. With the makeup and costume, you'll make people laugh and forget their troubles. Everybody loves a clown. And then my mother what is going on more about the clowning, and turned to me briefly and added, "You could put together a similar act." "Sure, Mom," I said, hoping my sarcasm escaped her, but I'd reached my limit. I felt guilty for behaving toward my mother this way when she loved me more than anyone else ever did or would. At the passenger drop-off curb at the airport, I leaned over to kiss her goodbye. I realized I'd miss her. My eyes moistened as I hugged her. "Take good care of yourself, Marcia," she said. And then I almost forgot as she dug a few long, skinny balloons out of her purse. "Take these to practice on. In no time at all, you'll be able to blow them up and twist them into animal shapes." "Thanks, Mom." I shoved them into my purse and left the photo of the two clowns on the front seat. On the way to the gate, I already missed her and wished I could see her more often. Still, I was relieved to be on my own again. It was difficult for me to resist getting sucked into how she defined me. My mother told me to live my life as she lived hers, like I was supposed to want what she wanted. Take up tap dancing, be a clown. Denying her felt like defying her. My mother was wrong to want me to be a clown, dress in a costume, and act the part. Suddenly I understood why my aversion to wearing costumes had grown stronger lately. I did not want to pretend to be someone else. I had been in hiding for so long. Why make it even harder to find me?